We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident.
Frances told me a few years later that she was sort of thrilled at the way that Diana sort of freed herself, as she saw it, from the shackles of royalty and from being a member of the royal family.
In the summer of 2013, a small genetics company in Edinburgh released a finding that quietly rewrote 2 centuries of royal family history. It wasn't a scandal involving money or an affair. It wasn't a leaked document or a tabloid sting. It was a swab of saliva, a strand of mitochondrial DNA, and a woman almost nobody had ever heard of. Her name was Eliza Kevork, and according to the Spencer family's own paperwork, she was a housekeeper of Armenian descent who lived in India in the early 1800s. According to her DNA, that story was, at best, incomplete. And because Eliza sits directly on Princess Diana's maternal line, the implications didn't stop with one obscure ancestor. They reached all the way down to Prince William, and one day, to the throne itself. This is the story of how a geneticist named Jim Wilson stumbled onto a genetic marker so rare that almost nobody outside South Asia carries it, how it ended up in the bloodline of the most photographed woman of the 20th century, and why the family who inherited it may never have known the truth at all. The project began with a straightforward scientific question. Could modern genetics confirm or challenge what the history books said about Eliza Kevork? To answer it, researchers at the University of Edinburgh, working with the ancestry testing company Britain's DNA, needed living descendants who sat on Eliza's unbroken maternal line, daughter to daughter to daughter, all the way down. They found 2 women, both third cousins of Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, and both willing to give a simple saliva sample. The reason the researchers wanted maternal line descendants specifically comes down to a quirk of human biology. Most of your DNA is a shuffled mix of both parents, recombined every generation, which makes it noisy and hard to trace very far back. Mitochondrial DNA is different. It's passed from a mother to all of her children largely unchanged, generation after generation, and only daughters pass it on again. A son inherits his mother's mitochondrial DNA, but he cannot pass it to his own children. His children get their mother's instead. That makes mitochondrial DNA a kind of unbroken thread, a message that travels cleanly down one specific line without being edited by anyone who marries into the family. If you want to know about a woman who lived 200 years ago, and you can find her direct female line descendants today, that thread is still there to read. When the 2 cousin samples came back, they matched each other, which was the first confirmation that the genealogical paper trail connecting them was accurate. But the second finding was the one that mattered. Both women carried a mitochondrial haplogroup called R30b, a lineage so uncommon that, at the time, researchers had found it in only a small handful of people out of tens of thousands of samples in global genetic databases. Of those, the overwhelming majority were from India, with one case reported in Nepal. According to Britain's DNA, R30b and its closely related branches, R30 and R30a, all trace back to South Asia, and no example had been recorded in Europe. That created an obvious problem for the official family story. If Eliza Kevork's descendants carried a maternal line genetic marker that, as far as researchers could tell, existed almost nowhere outside South Asia, then Eliza's mother's line was very unlikely to be purely Armenian, as the family had always said. Jim Wilson, the geneticist who led the analysis and who has spent much of his career studying population genetics, was quoted at the time describing the evidence as unassailable. His way of saying the result wasn't a fluke or an error, but a real signal pointing toward Indian ancestry on Eliza's direct maternal side. Piecing together Eliza's life means relying on a thin paper trail, colonial-era letters, estate records, and genealogical research rather than a full biography, so some details remain genuinely uncertain. What is generally agreed on is this: Eliza Kevork was born around 1790 and lived in and around Surat, a major trading port on India's western coast, in the region now known as Gujarat. Surat in that period was a crossroads of Armenian, Parsi, British, and local Gujarati merchant communities, all doing business within a few crowded streets of each other. It was exactly the kind of place where a woman with a mixed background, an Armenian surname on her father's side, and, according to the DNA, South Asian ancestry on her mother's, could live without her origins being treated as unusual, at least locally. Around 1809, a young Scottish merchant named Theodore Forbes arrived in Surat to work for the East India Company. Forbes came from a landowning family near Aberdeen, and like many company men of his generation, he was ambitious and focused on building a career inside one of the most lucrative trading operations in the world. Eliza became his housekeeper, and over time their relationship became something closer to a domestic partnership, though never a legal marriage, a common and largely tolerated arrangement for East India Company men in this period, even if it carried no formal recognition or protection for the woman involved. Together they had 2 children, a daughter, Catherine, born in 1812, and a son, Alexander, born a couple of years later. For a stretch of years, the family lived together, moving between Surat and later Mocha, in what is now Yemen, where Forbes took up a post as a British political resident, mostly overseeing the coffee trade and shipping routes near the Red Sea. Letters from this period, some of which survive in the Forbes family Scottish archives, suggest Eliza was more than a domestic employee. She appears to have helped Forbes navigate local languages and relationships in a genuinely useful, practical way. But as Forbes's career advanced and colonial attitudes hardened, the same social world that had quietly tolerated their relationship began to close around. British India in the 1810s and 1820s was moving toward much stricter racial and social boundaries than it had a generation earlier, and a domestic partner of South Asian or mixed heritage had become a serious liability for a man with professional ambitions in Bombay society. Forbes ultimately moved to Bombay to take up a more prestigious position, and Eliza and the children did not go with him in the way a legally recognized family would have. When Forbes died at sea in 1820, his will referred to Eliza only as his housekeeper and to Catherine as his natural daughter, language that, in the legal and social terms of the period, was designed to limit any formal claim they might have on the family name or estate. Catherine, still a child, was sent to Scotland to be raised among the Forbes family. Alexander's path is less documented in the sources available, and some accounts suggest he did not remain in Scotland long-term, though the details here are less firmly established than the rest of the story. What is clear is that Catherine grew up in Scotland, was absorbed into British aristocratic life, and eventually married into the lineage that leads, several generations later, to Francis Shand Kidd, and then to Diana Frances Spencer, born in 1961. Here is where the family's official history and the genetic evidence start to diverge. For roughly 200 years, Eliza Kevork was recorded in Spencer and Forbes' family genealogies as Armenian. There's a real basis for that label. Her father is believed to have carried an Armenian name, and surviving letters show she used Armenian script when she wrote. Armenian merchant communities had indeed lived in and around Surat for generations, often intermarrying with local families, so an Armenian father and an Indian mother is entirely plausible and consistent with the genetic evidence, rather than a story invented from nothing. But Armenian carried real social weight in the world Catherine was raised in. In 19th-century British India and in the aristocratic drawing rooms of Britain, Armenian ancestry, tied to an ancient Christian community, was treated as broadly acceptable, even exotic in a manageable way. Indian ancestry, especially on a woman's side, was treated very differently, as something that could threaten a family's social standing and marriage prospects for generations. Genealogists researching the Forbes and Spencer family trees have noted that this is very likely why Eliza's Indian heritage was minimized or left out altogether, while the Armenian half of her background was the version that survived in the paperwork. Whether that omission was a single deliberate decision by one family member, or simply the slow result of generations quietly not correcting an assumption, isn't fully documented, but the pattern, repeated across dozens of family trees and biographies well into the 20th century, speaks for itself. By the time Diana married Prince Charles in 1981, in a ceremony watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world, the biographies of her family still described Eliza Kevork as simply Armenian. Nobody publicly challenged that description until the genetic testing 30-plus years later suggested there was more to the story than the family tree had ever recorded. One of the more human details to come out of the 2013 announcement was a comment from Mary Roach, Diana's maternal aunt, who was among the older generation of the family reachable at the time the results became public. Roach reportedly responded to the news by saying she had always assumed she was part Armenian, and that she was pleased to learn she also had Indian heritage. It's a small, almost understated reaction, but it says something important. This wasn't a family actively guarding a known secret in 2013. As far as available evidence suggests, by the time this generation was alive, the Armenian story wasn't a lie anyone was consciously maintaining. It was simply the only version anyone had ever been told. That distinction matters, because it's easy to slide into a much more dramatic narrative than the evidence supports, one where generations of Spencers deliberately conspired to hide a secret they all knew. What the record actually supports is something a little less cinematic but arguably more interesting, an old omission, made under real social pressure in the 1820s, that calcified into an accepted fact simply because nobody had a reason, or the tools, to question it for nearly 2 centuries. It's worth being upfront about something the initial headlines mostly glossed over. not every geneticist accepted Britain's DNA's conclusions without reservation. Britain's DNA released its findings through press statements rather than a peer-reviewed paper, and independent genetic genealogists raised a fair critique at the time. Their argument was that R30b being rare in existing databases doesn't necessarily mean it's rare in Armenia specifically, because comparatively few Armenians had been sampled for mitochondrial DNA research compared to the much larger and more heavily studied Indian population. In other words, we haven't found this marker anywhere in Armenia is a different, weaker claim than this marker cannot exist in Armenia, especially with limited sample sizes. That critique doesn't overturn the finding so much as add a necessary layer of caution to it. The mitochondrial match between the two cousins is solid, and the concentration of R30b and its related branches in South Asian populations is a real and repeatedly observed pattern. But the leap from extremely likely South Asian, based on current data, to unassailable proof of Indian heritage, full stop, was, some independent researchers argued, more confident than the underlying sample sizes really justified. It's a useful reminder that even a genuinely fascinating genetic story can be presented with more certainty by a commercial testing company than the raw science alone would claim. Alongside the mitochondrial results, researchers also looked at the autosomal DNA of Diana's two cousins, the broader, whole genome DNA that does get reshuffled every generation, unlike mitochondrial DNA. That analysis reportedly showed the cousins carried somewhere between roughly 0.3 and 0.8% South Asian ancestry, with the rest of their genome being of European origin. On the surface, that sounds like a second, independent confirmation of the mitochondrial finding, and it likely reflects some real South Asian ancestry entering the family around Eliza's generation. But geneticists who looked closely at the numbers pointed out an important wrinkle. At 7 or 8 generations removed from Eliza Kevork, the amount of autosomal DNA any specific ancestor contributes becomes small and unpredictable, purely through the ordinary math of inheritance. It's entirely possible for a descendant this many generations out to carry no detectable segment from a particular ancestor at all, simply due to how DNA gets divided up each generation. It isn't guaranteed to be an even, predictable split. So while the small percentage of South Asian ancestry found in the cousins is consistent with the mitochondrial story, it can't be treated as ironclad proof on its own, and some analysts have noted that Prince William, being one generation further removed than the cousins, sits close to the point where a specific ancestor's autosomal contribution might not be reliably detectable at all, even though his mitochondrial DNA, which follows a much stricter all-or-nothing rule, is essentially guaranteed to match. Strip away the tabloid framing, and the biology here is genuinely elegant. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited in a strict, unbroken line from mother to child, but only daughters pass it forward. That means Diana carried Eliza Kevork's mitochondrial DNA, and so do her sons, William and Harry. But because mitochondrial DNA only travels onward through daughters, neither William nor Harry can pass this specific genetic marker on to their own children. William's children inherit their mitochondrial DNA from their mother, Catherine, not from him. In strict genetic terms, this particular thread, the one that runs back through 7 generations of women to a port city in Gujarat around 1790, ends with William and Harry's generation. It doesn't disappear because of any scandal or decision. It simply reaches the natural stopping point built into how mitochondrial inheritance works. That detail is part of what makes this story land the way it does. It isn't really about scandal, concealment, or a single villain erasing a woman from the record on purpose. It's about how ordinary social pressure in a specific time and place, the aristocratic anxieties of 1820s British India, shaped which parts of a person's identity got written down and which didn't, and how modern genetics, almost 200 years later, can still recover what was quietly left out. Eliza Kevork's name was never erased from existence. It just sat, largely unexamined, in old letters and family trees that nobody had reason to question, until a saliva sample and a mitochondrial haplogroup gave her story a way back into the light. It's worth remembering that Eliza Kevork's situation, while unusual to modern eyes, wasn't especially rare for its time and place. Relationships between East India Company employees and local or Eurasian women were common enough in the late 18th and early 19th centuries that they had their own informal vocabulary and social expectations, arrangements that were tolerated, even normal, in port cities like Surat and Bombay, provided nobody expected them to carry any legal weight back in Britain. Children from these relationships were sometimes acknowledged, educated, and even sent to Britain, as Catherine was. But the mothers themselves were rarely given lasting formal status, and their names tended to fade from the record far faster than their children's did. In that sense, Eliza's story isn't just a one-off curiosity buried in Diana's family tree. It's a small, well-documented example of a much larger and fairly well-studied pattern in colonial-era genealogy, where a woman's contribution to a family line survived far better in DNA than it ever did on paper. This also helps explain why the Armenian label was such a convenient landing spot for the family story. Armenian trading communities really did have a long, well-established, and socially respectable presence across the Indian Ocean trading world, including in Surat. An Armenian father, or at least an Armenian-adjacent surname, gave the family a plausible, low-friction explanation that didn't require anyone to say anything untrue outright. It just required leaving out the part about her mother's ancestry. Over enough decades and enough retellings, an incomplete story and an inaccurate one can end up looking identical on paper, even if nobody involved set out to deceive anyone. It's sometimes pointed out, alongside the Eliza Kevork story, that Diana's own ancestry included multiple lines back to English royalty, including descents from illegitimate children of King Charles II through several of his well-documented mistresses. Genealogists have long noted that, strictly by number of documented lines back to English monarchs, Diana's own bloodline was arguably richer in that regard than Prince Charles's, whose family name had German royal origins before it was changed to Windsor during the First World War for political reasons. This isn't part of the DNA story uncovered in 2013, it comes from conventional paper genealogy that was known well before Diana's wedding, but it adds an interesting layer to the larger picture, a family tree that was simultaneously more connected to historic English royalty than official retellings sometimes emphasized, and less transparent about a South Asian ancestor than the record admitted, for very different reasons in each case.